Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So just so I think people in this room probably know it, but also for folks streaming online, hashtag #MeToo led to hashtag Time's Up. So a lot of people get those two things confused.
That's true.
So at what point, once the organization was founded, at what point did the idea of a legal defense fund come in?
So what happened was, as people started coming forward about Harvey Weinstein, a group called Alianza de Campesinas, a farm worker group, published this letter called the Dear Sisters letter. And it was a letter to the women who had come forward in Hollywood saying, we hear you, we see you, we know what you're going through because this is what we go through too. And that moment of women from Hollywood and farm workers, not groups that usually, are seen as the same type of people, realize that they have this awful thing in common. And so the women in Hollywood came together with lawyers and PR people and decided that they wanted to make a fund that would help women like the farm workers who had so many fewer resources but were facing the same or even worse sex harassment at work.
So who funds the fund?
So everyone funds the fund. We have received donations from numerous countries, from every state you can think of. Some of them obviously are these high-level people with lots of money, but we receive donations in, in about $5 increments from people. So everyone who's interested and cares about sex harassment has been funding the fund.
From the day it started to today, how much money has the fund raised?
So we've raised about $25 million so far.
And that's in what time period?
that gets this.
Yeah.
Since we started in about January 2018. And thus far, and I know we're going to be talking about the work that the fund does, we've committed about $6 million of that to help fund cases of workplace sex harassment and investigations for low-wage workers.
I want a little bit of your background because you worked in the Justice Department.
That's right. I've been doing women's rights work and civil rights work for about 20 years. And I have to say, if any point in that time you would have told me that there would be a fund that would actually give money so that low-wage workers could sue their employers and would care about low-wage workers, I would have laughed at you. I would have told you that could never exist. The fact that the fund exists and the fact that I get to do this job, I can't imagine a job that a lawyer like me could want more. This is absolutely the place I would want to be.
So on a philosophical level, why is this possible? Something that you never dreamed in your career could be possible. Why do you think it is?
I think it's possible because women made the connection between these, high-level, famous women and farm worker women, and realizing that this happens to all women, and not just women, obviously, men too. And that's why Me Too, the hashtag that you mentioned to start this off with, was so important, because people started to realize this is just a common experience. This isn't about me specifically. And one of the things that we do see is when you're sexually harassed at work, a lot of people feel like it's their fault, right? And they don't want to come forward. And one of the things that Me Too did, and one of the things that we're seeing with the people coming forward to us, is that that's not true. And we can say that with certainty. It is not your fault. You did nothing to make this happen. This is something that's systemic, and it needs a systemic response.
Can you tell us about the volume of people requesting
So
help?
Since we started in January 2018, we've had over 4,000 people reach out to us asking us for assistance. So the way this works is, if you want assistance from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, you fill in one of our forms, which is online, and then we have a bank of about 800 attorneys who have joined our legal network. And those attorneys have agreed to give anybody coming through the fund a first consultation for free. And in that consultation, the attorney talks to the person about what their legal rights are and what they could possibly do. And unfortunately, because it's very hard to come forward, sometimes what that person hears is you're out of time, because there are very strict time limits about when you have to bring forward a case. And so they may be out of time, or a terrible thing may have happened, but the law requires it to be to a certain standard, and this may not meet that standard. So it's not always good news, but it is news that you can now know what you can do going forward. Sometimes the attorney decides to take the case, and then they can come to us to help with funding.
Before we talk about what you can do as the attorneys in the Times Up Legal Fund, what are ways that some employers have been using the law to protect themselves from sexual harassment?
So one of the things that employers do is they have people sign non-disclosure agreements. And sometimes this is, that very first day of work when you're signing everything like your health benefits and this is where the bathroom is. You're signing something that says, I will not talk about sex harassment if it happens to me at work. I will not sue my employer publicly if that happens to me at work. And frankly, most people don't notice that they're signing this, right? Because it's part of the first day package. And most people really want the job, and so they're going to sign it. And some of these non-disclosure agreements have really onerous provisions in them, like if you break it, you will pay your employer $500,000. And so it's obviously very difficult for workers to come forward if you've signed something like that. So that's one of the ways employers help keep it a secret.
Is there any sort of strategy within the Time's Up legal community? I mean, when we think about the way Ruth Bader Ginsburg chose all those specific cases, the way Thurgood Marshall chose all these small specific cases so they could get to the big case. Is there any kind of legal strategy when it comes to sexual harassment in the workplace that you, attorneys like you and attorneys who volunteer their time, they see that's the case we should take because that could lead to something bigger?
Certainly. So we're always looking for cases that will expand the law, that will do something like challenge non-disclosure agreements. But the other thing that the Time's Up group did that was really smart is they put the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund at the National Women's Law Center. So the National Women's Law Center is a 40-year-old organization that's a leader in issues about protecting the rights of women and girls and in the issue of sex harassment. So while we do the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund there, the National Women's Law Center works on things like policy change. And so in some states, we're seeing states moving against non-disclosure agreements. We're seeing some states allowing people to have longer time limits, to cover more types of employers. So cover more types of employees. And so that's part of what the National Women's Law Center does, and we at the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund are a beneficiary of that.
Would you mind sharing one or two cases you think really are an example of why this fund is so important?
Sure. So I think one of the cases that some people may have heard of is we're funding investigations that have to do with workers at McDonald's. So these are fast food workers all over the country, and they're being sexually harassed by their supervisors or their coworkers. Routinely, they are told that this is just, part of the job, or you just have to put up with it. Or they complain, but then their shifts get cut and they're fired, or they're told there's no more work for them. So we're funding an investigation for lots of those kinds of charges. We're also funding cases where people have come forward and then been sued for defamation. And so this is something that we're seeing much more frequently than we anticipated. People come forward, they speak about the sex harassment they've encountered, and then the person who harassed them sues them for defamation. So we're helping with those cases as well.
I'm curious, last award season, this is obviously based out of Hollywood with these women who came together. And at every award ceremony in 2018, you saw a Time's Up pin and everyone spoke about it. This past award season, we didn't hear that much about it. How do you keep fatigue from happening? How do you keep your foot on the gas pedal when it stops being the big headline?
Yes, I agree that it wasn't at the award ceremony, but it hasn't hit, the fatigue has not hit at all. We are still seeing people donating to the fund. We're still seeing people coming forward. And then you're seeing things like, just this past year, women in McDonald's walked out of work to protest sex harassment. So that's amazing. That's the first time that's happened in over 100 years. But then a couple of months later, workers at Google walked out as well. And again, you're seeing this, McDonald's workers, Google workers, not usually the people who are doing the same types of things, but they're affected by the same thing and they're using the same strategy. So I don't think the momentum is going away at all. I think it's very strong.
What is an example of something that has been a huge challenge for you? We've talked about all the great stuff. We've got the money, we've got the workers feeling empowered to walk out. What has been one of the stubborn things that's been hard to move?
So one of the things that we see over and over again is we help people find legal representation. And we help people also who are coming forward with media help, because sometimes what you need to do is talk publicly about it, and that's something people need to be trained on how to do. That's not the full panoply of what people need. People who are coming forward need therapy. They need counseling. They need hotlines. And obviously we can, connect them to those things. Those things exist already. But those services are overwhelmed, and those services are not fully funded, and people don't have the health care to pay for those services. So to actually get survivors to the place where they need to be, there needs to be this full set of things to help them. And then the other thing we see is that retaliation is so prevalent against people who come forward. And so it's very common to see shifts being cut, being told there's no more work for them, or being fired. And so helping people find other jobs is really difficult. And especially when you're talking about, people in rural communities where there's only one big employer, or people in certain industries where word of mouth gets out. And it's not, oh, she complained of sex harassment. It's, oh, she's difficult, right? She's hard to work with. Well, that's going to be very hard if it's the kind of industry where word of mouth is what gets you your next job.
We've got about 6 more minutes, so I'm going to ask the mics to go out while I ask a couple more questions so you folks have a chance to ask Sharyn some questions. So what are some of the examples of, you talked about the very overt examples of harassment. What are some of the more systemic examples that your fund or attorneys could go after, or ones that people don't necessarily think about being an issue?
So when we talk about sex harassment, most people think of it as, coming on to people, touching, grabbing. But the other kind of sex harassment is this idea that you, because of your sex, don't belong here. And so we see that with heavily male workplaces, firefighters, police officers, in the military. And so women harassed simply for being women.
As opposed to
it being about, I don't like to describe it as desire, because that's not what sex harassment is about. Right. It's about power. But as opposed to the sort of coming on type of sex harassment, it's the more women don't belong here, they're cut off when they're trying to talk about it, they're not supported when they have ideas, that kind of sex harassment.
So sort of the ingrained stuff.
Yes.
What is something that a workplace could do? Let's say there's somebody who realizes that their workplace is problematic. They don't want to lose their job, of course, but they want to do something. What are one or two or three steps someone could take?
So one of the important steps is being a good bystander, and that means helping the person who's being harassed. And that can be in the moment, taking their side, talking to the harasser afterwards, talking to the person afterwards, going with them to HR. All of those things are important. Knowing your own system, knowing who to complain to and where HR is and who the person is to talk to. Lots of workers don't know that simple step, just because it's, again, one of those things you sign at the first day and you probably don't notice it until you actually need it. So those are very important steps. And then for employers, it's incredibly important to have really strong policies, a commitment from the top, and make it clear that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated, even when it's behavior by your superstars, which is something that we see very frequently, that, there's a rule, but it doesn't apply to this person because they're a rainmaker or because they're famous. That's going to be hugely problematic.
I think you'd also probably need to have some sort of Good Samaritan legislation, because people don't want to help out because they're afraid for their jobs.
Oh, but they are protected. So the law actually protects you if you oppose a practice that is illegal under Title VII, which is the main civil rights law. So yes, they would be protected if they were trying to help somebody.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Okay. Stand up. Hello, I'm Sandra Muller. I'm one of the Person of the Year of Time Magazine for the Me Too movement. I'm French. I launched the Me Too movement in France 2 days before the Me Too movement. And it's the name is Expose. It's Expose Your Pig. So I think you can guess that I asked to everybody to give their name. So I'm happy to see you because I never had time to get in touch with you. I did everything by myself. I'm sued for defamation. The guy recognized that he harassed me in a big newspaper in France, and finally he sued me for defamation for 104,000 euro. So I'm sued now. I will just take the opportunity to know if you can give me some advice, if I can go and see you after. And do you think there is much more progress now with Time's Up? Do you think that women, they speak out more?
So unfortunately, we only work in the United States because that's where our lawyers work. So I can't help directly, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about your situation. I do think that there's more success. I do think more people are speaking up. As you said, it can be, as your situation shows, it can be very difficult when you speak up, but I do think more people are certainly coming forward.
I think we have a question up front.
Yes, hi, my name is Neil Berger.
You wait, hang one second, Neil, let's get you a mic so folks can hear you.
I'm sorry. Hi, my name is Neil
out?
Berger, and I think your mission is incredible, important, and a change agent. May I ask you, since the conference is Atlantic Inclusion, the lawyers comprised in the organization, is it comprised of a lot of women, LGBT, transgender in your organization?
In my organization, in the Time's Up, or in the people we're helping, or both?
The people that you're helping, both, and the fund.
So in the people that we're helping, the vast majority of people who are coming forward to us are women, but we do have some men. About 9% of the people who have come forward to us identify as LGBTQ. About 1/3 identify as women of color. About 2/3 identify as low-wage workers.
and the lawyers comprised in the fund, are they?
Oh,
Yes,
so
absolutely.
the 800 lawyers that we have,
Yeah.
it's a wide range. It covers every kind.
Okay, thanks.
Right over here.
Hi, my name is Camille AC. I don't have an organization, but I just wanted to ask, I mean, Alison, I love your show so much. I'm really happy you're there, but the backdrop of you and also Tanzina Vega being there is the toppling of white media man. What work is being done to get out in front of patriarchy and give women of color and women opportunities ahead of this rather than being reactive towards it?
So that's why I'm so glad that the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is at the National Women's Law Center, right? Because we talk about this as doing litigation, but also doing policy change and cultural change. And that's what the National Women's Law Center is so wonderful at, all of those things. So we are doing things like changing policies, working on state laws, working to try to get these federal laws to be improved so that more people can come forward, and so that there are rules like, you know, in New York State, for example, there are now rules about you have to have training on sex harassment, and that the standard for sex harassment has become more worker friendly. Those are things that are the kinds of changes we really need.
I have to ask you two questions before we go. One's tough, one's a softball. The tough one, the president of Time's Up, Lisa Borders, had to step down because there was an allegation of sexual harassment against someone in her family. Who is going to be leading the organization? Do you know? Has the mission changed at all? The direction changed at all?
The direction has not changed, and the mission has not changed. And the former COO is taking over for right now, and then we're looking for someone else.
What is the case that you've had that you're proudest of?
There is one that we are funding right now that has to do with women working in a heavily male atmosphere, a heavily male job, and they've come forward. And why I love this one so much is because the women haven't left the workplace yet, and it's a public service job, and the way they describe how much they love what they do and how important it is to them to stay at this job, and the fact that we are funding a case that's going to make their work conditions better but allow them to stay at the job, that's really what the perfect part of this is.
Sharyn, Tejani, thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you all.